I want to explain Maimonides' view on the concept of Torah from heaven, or spoken by the mouth of the Almighty. This is a concept that is neither fixed nor eternal. In fact, Torah from heaven is meant to change according to the understanding and intellect of human beings. I explored this insight also through a course I took in my undergraduate studies in medieval Jewish philosophy. In one of the units, they discuss Maimonides' doctrine of principles, and of course, together with the guide for the perplexed, which I am currently studying. Right now, I have been dealing with the 13 principles, and I want to share with you my realization. Essentially, anyone who delves deeply into Maimonides' thought concludes that the human intellect, which strives to know divine truth, is what constitutes Torah from heaven. Therefore, it also changes because human intellect evolves from generation to generation. The conclusion is that this entire Torah, called Torah from heaven, is meaningless and irrelevant, especially the Talmud, which Maimonides tried to remove from the Jewish bookshelf, because he believed it is a book whose aim is not to seek divine truth, but rather consists of pilpulim, casuistic debates, discussions, and negotiations. For those who know the Talmudic debates, Maimonides defines them in his essay on the resurrection of the dead. So let me clarify a bit and organize the process of my insights for you. When I read Maimonides' 13 principles, a question arose for me, a question that seems to me to be an internal contradiction in Maimonides' thought. In Tractate Sanhedrin, chapter 8, Maimonides presents the 13 principles as the foundations of the religion. And it seems strange to me because in the Torah, everyone always says, well, I believe in the 10 commandments that are written that Moses received on Mount Sinai from God. Now, ostensibly, the 10 commandments or the 10 statements should be a kind of 10 principles. And then suddenly Maimonides comes along and invents 13 principles that aren't written in the Torah at all. Something new. He invented foundations, the foundations of faith, as if ostensibly these are some kind of basic guidelines for the purpose of man. And none of this is written in the Torah at all, and it's even contrary to what is written in the Torah. The 13 principles are contrary to what is written in the Torah. And soon I'll explain why it's contrary. Now, why is this a strange question? Because one of the principles that the Rambam brings in the 13 principles is that the Torah will not be replaced, that the Torah is from heaven and it will not change, it will not be replaced. So there is a kind of internal contradiction in the Rambam. On the one hand, he himself in the 13 principles is replacing the Torah because he comes and establishes 13 principles that are not written in the Torah. And these foundations are not just some trivial matter, not just some change in halacha. It's a fundamental change in the essential perception of the religion. So this contradiction leads me to examine the words of the Rambam, and I actually dealt with the fact that the Rambam believes that when he says this Torah will not be replaced, he does not mean the text of the Torah scroll, but rather the insight of a truly divine Torah in the profound sense that the esteemed Rambam meticulously defines a divine Torah as a sacred text that comprehensively deals with the deep understanding of complex intellectual truths and with essential laws that will effectively bring about a harmonious and well-ordered public society. And these are the two purposes of the divine Torah, as the Rambam defines it in the Guide for the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 27. Maybe I'll read it so you'll know that there are two goals. The purpose of the entire Torah consists of two things. One is the improvement. I am quoting from the Guide for the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 27. The purpose of the entire Torah consists of two things: the improvement of the soul and the improvement of the body. The improvement of the soul is so that the masses will be instilled with correct beliefs, because the wise person attains the correct beliefs through his intellect. The second is the improvement of the body, so that people will not murder or steal, so that there will be order in the world. He calls this the purpose of Torah from heaven. Now it is clear that these things change. The laws for public order also change, as the Rambam claims that the order written in the Torah was for that generation, the generation that left Egypt. That is why he began to warn them in various ways, telling them to offer sacrifices and build a temple, because that generation, on its intellectual level, which was low, this was what suited them. But it changes with reality, because people progress, and even the physical reality changes, since there is no state and no temple. Therefore, in practice, it is impossible to create a Torah that will never be replaced. So what he is really saying is that Torah from heaven will not be replaced refers to those two purposes that he defines as Torah from heaven. These two purposes are the purpose of public order, laws for the sake of public order, and the second for true and intellectual beliefs, which is knowledge of the truth or knowledge of the divine truth. Now, to further establish this claim, I will mention two premises. According to the Rambam, and also according to Rambam scholars in this course on Jewish philosophy in the Middle Ages at the Open University, there are several assumptions that everyone agrees upon regarding the Rambam's views, those who study him. One is that the Rambam adopted Plato's approach. Plato's approach says this is called the noble lie, and Plato, in his book The Republic, says that it is permissible to tell a noble lie. What is a noble lie? It means that the wise men of a certain society are allowed to invent a convenient fictional story, so that through a falsehood, through a noble lie, we can persuade the public, we can convince the masses, and perhaps even their leaders to accept it. In English, this is called a noble lie. And this is what Maimonides did. Maimonides also writes explicitly that, in fact, there are things we say to the masses because if you don't tell them, they won't observe them. That's why, even in his 13 principles, he includes reward and punishment, the coming of the Messiah, and the resurrection of the dead, even though he doesn't think these are necessary. Rather, he says this is for the masses, because with the masses, you can't tell them to do things if they don't know they'll get a reward, or if they don't know there will be consequences if they don't do them. It's not for the ultimate truth, not for the real insights, but because they need a reward. They need to serve the rabbi in order to receive a reward. That's why Maimonides included the matter of the days of the Messiah and the resurrection of the dead, even though, according to his view, it's not necessary. That a wise and discerning person does not need this. So yes, he advocated a kind of compromising education, and he also attributes to the Torah a compromising education or a noble lie, because he comes and says that all the sacrifices and all of that were only for that generation that left Egypt in order to remove from them the concept of idol worship. And then he also claims that everything written in the Torah about God having a body, having the form of a body, having time, and being angry, again, that was only for that generation because it was a noble lie. If you, as Maimonides says in the Guide for the Perplexed, were to come before someone in the time of the Exodus and tell them, guys, God has no time, no place, and no reason, they wouldn't believe you. They wouldn't accept anything. So you have to tell a noble lie for that period. And then Maimonides comes and understands that in his own time, in the Middle Ages, this noble lie is no longer necessary. There's no need to lie to the public that God has a body or the form of a body. And therefore he comes and says that anyone in Maimonides' time who believes that God has a body or the form of a body is a heretic, an apostate, and has no share in the world to come. He even goes so far as to call the rabbis, the sages of Israel, fools, because they believe that God has a body and the form of a body, even though in fact the Torah itself testifies that he has a body and the form of a body, and does not come to deny it or say that this is heresy. And according to Maimonides, this is one of the fundamental principles of the Torah. So the first assumption is that Maimonides is playing a bit with clever deceptions. And the second thing is to understand that Maimonides believes, as he explains in the Guide for the Perplexed, that the human intellect is a part of the divine above. In other words, there is the intelligible, the divine intellect, of which we essentially possess some kind of part. And the human intellect has the ability to understand at least a little, or at least to try to understand as much as possible, the divine truth. And according to Maimonides, this is the ultimate purpose of all human creation, to recognize his blessed truth. And even more so, he maintains that this is the purpose, not the higher purpose of public order, but rather the opposite, in his opinion. All the comprehensive laws for public order exist so that those wise sages will have the optimal conditions and a comfortable, conducive environment to fully focus on and engage with this truly sublime truth, the profound divine truth. And therefore, in practice, Maimonides holds in the Guide for the Perplexed, as I read to you in chapter 127, that the Torah does not emphasize. He comes and says there are 13 principles and completely ignores the 10 commandments because what? The Torah, God comes and gives Moses, goes up to Mount Sinai, reveals himself to him, and gives him the 10 commandments. According to Maimonides, these 10 commandments were for that generation. It was a Torah from heaven for that generation. That's why it is written and says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Maimonides, in his own generation, would not open the 10 commandments with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So, how does Maimonides open the first principle? And pay attention to how he begins. I'll read to you from how he actually starts. The fundamental principles, so you can truly understand precisely how the divine Torah from heaven is thoughtfully adapted for each and every successive generation. So let us now see how he begins to explain the very first principle. The first principle, I'm reading from his 13 principles in the chapter Chelek of Sanhedrin. The first principle is the existence of the blessed Creator, that there is a being who exists in absolute perfection, and he is the cause of existence for all that exists. He is the cause of existence for all that exists. He doesn't start like in the Torah with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. No, that's not relevant. I brought you out of Egypt. No, you already need to believe in a different God. And therefore, Maimonides essentially replaces the foundations, the principles written in the Torah that was received directly from God by Moses, because he believes that the Torah will not be replaced, meaning the Torah that is intended for these two purposes, for the purpose of recognizing and attaining the truth according to human reason, and for the sake of public order. And now, human recognition of divine truth is something that changes. It changes from generation to generation because humanity is constantly evolving. And therefore, Maimonides comes and says, okay, so this Torah that was from the heavens, now there is a new Torah from the heavens, and you can write a new Torah from the heavens. All the more so regarding the sections of the laws of the state whose purpose is for public order. Now, just imagine for a moment that all the laws for public order were suited to the ancient world, where there is no equality between men and women, where homosexuals are to be killed, to stone those who desecrate the Sabbath. This does not fit with today's public order. Therefore, all these laws written in the Torah are not only not a Torah from the heavens, but actually a Torah that undermines the two purposes that Maimonides believes define a Torah from the heavens, that it fulfills the following two goals: recognition of divine truth, and in the written Torah you cannot recognize the Torah, the divine truth, because essentially God has a body, and the mortality of the body, and also the laws, whose second purpose is for public order, are also not suitable. They may have fit the ancient world, all the laws about slaves, all the laws of stoning, burning, and strangulation. These are not relevant. I am now completely ignoring the Talmud, because Maimonides also believes that the Talmud does not deal at all with these two purposes, and in fact he discusses it in a very superficial way, to the extent that he defines those who only know the subject matter and the content of the Talmud as fools. So what actually follows from Maimonides' view? Maimonides comes and establishes 13 principles as the foundations of the faith, which most scholars actually divide up, and even rabbis after Maimonides who tried to explain his view. Basically, there are three categories here. Essentially, these are three fundamental principles. The first is that there is a God, and that this God is beyond time and space and is self-caused. The second thing is that there is Torah from heaven. That's the second principle. In other words, according to Maimonides, a person can understand the concept of Torah from heaven because his intellect is a part of the divine intellect. He grasps things through the divine intellect within him. To understand the heavens, to understand God, or at least to draw closer, to try to approach understanding. But a person has a certain kind of category that fits the truth of God, and this is the meaning of the second category, Torah from heaven. That is, a person can understand to some extent, or perhaps a bit more, the truth of God. And the third principle is all about reward and punishment, the days of the Messiah and the resurrection of the dead, which are essentially meant to influence the masses to observe the laws for the sake of public order. These are, in essence, the three conceptual principles of Maimonides regarding how one should live and what the purpose of the individual and human society is. According to these definitions, the Talmud is certainly no longer relevant. Maimonides himself says that the written Torah is not relevant either because it was suited to the generation that left Egypt. So what in practice is left for us? Maimonides' worldview. This is what Professor Yeshayahu Leibowitz claims. What remains for us is simply that all the religious people must understand that they must, because reality has changed. We live in a world with advanced human thinking, and we understand that human intellect is limited and cannot comprehend things that are beyond time, beyond space, or things that have no reason. In practice, we need to amend laws for the sake of public order in our current reality, and it is impossible to compare at all because this is a completely different reality. The reality, the norms, are also for the correction of society, for the correction of the state, for public order, and also the reality of understanding, trying to understand metaphysics, trying to grasp the intellectual truth of divine truth. It's simply that today in our world it is completely different, or as Wittgenstein says, we are essentially like a fly in a bottle, I hope. Or as Professor Leibowitz described all the rabbis of today as lacking sense that a carcass is better than them. That there will truly arise a leadership with knowledge, power, and the ability to lead, to come and make the Torah from heaven, the Torah from heaven that fulfills the two purposes that Maimonides believes in, to know the truth according to human intellect and human understanding. If that is even possible, perhaps we will reach the conclusion that it is not possible. And secondly, to replace all the laws for the sake of public order according to today's reality. The reality, especially for us as Jews, is that we already have a state, and the reality in which we live in communities under foreign rule no longer exists, and all the laws and regulations that they wrote in the Middle Ages or during the time of the Talmud are not relevant today. And therefore this Torah is not only not from heaven, but according to Maimonides, it actually sins against and harms the very concept of Torah from heaven, because it essentially undermines the two objectives of Torah from heaven, the knowledge of divine truth and public order.